Good morning. Welcome to Pivot Point. I'm your host, Barry Sacro, and today we're going to talk about some of my favorite people. We're going to talk about Davy Crockett, Andrew Jackson, not on my favorite list, and the Supreme Court of the United States. We're going to see if they're on my list or on my list, and I think we're going to figure that one out pretty quick. But I'm going to go start with talking about Davy Crockett again. And Davy Crockett and a future president of the United States served in the militias of Tennessee together. And they knew each other. Andrew Jackson and Davy Crockett knew each other pretty well. They fought with each other, were in the same service. They were literally from the same school. But Andrew Jackson believed in a manifest destiny that was going to take land away that currently belonged to tribes. Those tribes knew that was coming. And they knew that was coming because the Americans had been taking away land while the British had fought to keep their land. And the Cherokees, along with the Creeks, were on their list. Jackson had fought against the Creeks in the Red Stick War and other times. And he wanted them moved. There's no question about it. Some of the richest farmland that the continent ever produced in what is now the states of Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi. This farmland grew crops like no place in the world. Crops that had been genetically engineered by Native Americans. They did not have a culture of machines, but they did have a culture of planting. And so this corn fed everybody. Everybody from the Iroquois and the Mohawks up in the Northeast through the Mississippian culture that ran all the way out to Cahokia, part of what is now East St. Louis. This corn grown in these bread baskets was what supported that culture. Culture, as you know, by that point, is on the wane. So in 1835, they began the process of removing the tribes east of the Mississippi to Indian country, which was essentially arid land in Oklahoma. Land that would become an arid disaster with clouds of black dust when they attempted to turn that land, pasture land, into farmland. Well, this is way before that. And this breadbasket, the Creeks were there, and they were there up into the Appalachian Mountains, and in the Appalachian Mountains and the environs, the tribes that were up there included the eastern and western bands of the Cherokee. And the decision was to move them to Oklahoma. Some of them went out and looked at it from the Cherokees. They said, this land is no good for us. This is not our home. Davy Crockett, in support of his friends and his allies in tribes, including the Cherokee, began to fight against it. But the Cherokee were smart. They weren't just tribal people. They had become part of the society of America and were literate. And so when Andrew Jackson began this process of removing the Native Americans, removing them from their homes, Davy Crockett fought against them. A side note that I have mentioned before is the mission of St. Leo, which was the first stop on Mission Road, starting in Tallahassee. And I know this story because they tell it at this monument. In 1713, the militia from the Carolinas came down to attack the Spanish along Mission Road. At the entrance to Mission Road was a fort. South of that fort, just south of that fort, was the mission that was the mission for Tallahassee, and then the road that went all the way to Miami. And so down marched the militias from the Carolinas with the Yamasee at their head. And so when they marched, they attacked the first fort, not the first fort, but the second fort. And the reason for that was because the first fort actually had a real fort with real soldiers in it protecting the border. But the second and the rest of the missions, Spanish Catholic missions, were all right there. In 1995, the family who had owned the mission, where the mission was located, owned the plantation where the mission was located, and the village of Tallahassee, still occupied at that point by the Temucans, the family sold it to the state of Florida in 1995. Not too long after that, a delegation arrives at the state archaeologist's office and asks, "Is the state archaeologist here?" He said, "Yes." And out he comes. And they started right away. They said, "Good afternoon. We know you bought the plantation that contained the city of Tallahassee before it was a white city on it, and you're about to make an attraction. It's there. That's St. Leo's." And they were. The delegation asked, "Do you have a map?" The archaeologist brought out a map, opened it up and spread it out. And the lead who spoke, who was the chief, began to talk about what was going on. And he first pointed at that spot over there. He said, "That was our chapel. Our Catholic grandfathers are buried there. Do not dig it up. Leave them be." He drew a circle on the map. He said, "Now, I know that you believe that this inside this circle was a burial mound. You're wrong. There are multiple mounds. So let me show you what it actually looks like." And he drew out 3 circles. He said, "This one you found. This one you found a piece of, and you believe that these 2 are connected. They are not. They are separate burial mounds, and our grandfathers are buried there. There's a 3rd mound. You haven't found that, any of it yet. It's right here. Don't bother that either. Our grandfathers are buried there." And then they began to describe the village. So there was a path, a circular path, and it went right through here. And along the path were crosses, including ones here, 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 and here. Over here was the council house. Council house was big enough to hold 2,000 people, it's claimed. They said, "You want to do something with the council house? Knock yourself out. That's okay. It's not sacred ground. It was a large building of ours, and we loved it, but do what you want there." The archaeologist stopped him and said, "Excuse me, but I have to ask, who are you people?" And he said, "We're the descendants of the last people that lived here." They said, "There are no longer any descendants of the Florida Indians." They said, "Oh, yes, there are." He said, "Well, where do you live?" They said, "We live in the Red River area of northern Louisiana, on the west side of the Mississippi River." So they were not included in the census of 1835. I said, "Wow. And you have memories of that?" They said, "We speak Temucan at home." Temucan. That language hadn't been heard on this continent since 1763, when the last remnants went to Havana. They speak Temucan at home. They said, "You speak Temucan at home? How come we don't know about this?" They said, "Well, something happened." He said, "You know what? I do know something." He pulls out a picture. He says, "We don't know what this is connected to. Maybe you do." The picture is titled "Last Remnant of the Florida Indians, 1901. He said, "I absolutely know who that is. That's my great-grandfather, the chief. And that's my grandfather who would follow him as the chief. And that's a picture of my tribal family from what was then almost 100 years back." Wow. "How come you took this picture, and how come you stopped?" He said, "Well, not too long after that, a movie came out. And these people were wearing strange outfits with pointy hats, and they were all white. And they were burning crosses and attacking people. And in the beginning, we were fearful for our Christian grandfathers, but soon we realized that they were coming after everybody, even people of faith. In fact, the Catholics were one of the people they specifically went after. And although they never came after Native Americans, they certainly came after African Americans, and we didn't want to take the chance. So we stopped telling everybody who we were. We stopped speaking Temucan except when we were home among ourselves. We stopped practicing rituals which we continue to this day, hopefully to make ourselves safe from these people. The movie, of course, Birth of a Nation. The people were the Ku Klux Klan. Their outfits, with their pointy hats and their fiery crosses, we know all too well. And we know all too well not just its origins, but we know all too well how it manifested itself in the times that come past, including the times I'm more familiar with, like we talked about last week, the era of civil rights. So the last remnants of the Florida Indians, as represented there in that office that day, were then asked, well, maybe you can help us. We wonder if you would submit to some genetic testing, because it's common we find bones and other artifacts from Native Americans, and we're not sure what period they're from. We wonder if we could do some work. The chief replied, no problem at all, but there is one thing. Wherever you get to do this testing, it can't be the Americans. We don't trust the Americans. They have lied to us, for us, and about us for as long as we have memory. So if you want to do this genetic testing, it's going to have to be done by somebody besides Americans. The genetic testing, by the way, is being done, and it's being done by a Scandinavian organization based in Copenhagen. The tribe still speaks Timucua at home, maybe with a little more pride, because their last home is being remembered. Of course, so was the changes that went on. And we can't remember them without a picture of the tribe who led this army into the Timucua and Ace and Calusa tribal homes. They were led by the Yamsi, the last 13 of whom, allegedly, since heard about many more, but the last 13 were spotted outside the walls of St. Augustine, where they waited for the ships that would take them to Havana, which had been traded back to the Spanish in exchange for La Florida, going to the British. The Yamsi were blamed for many of these wars, but in truth, it was their contact with whites that made Yamsis disintegrate. And of late, many families have come back with memories in that North Carolina area, part of the Lumbar group of tribes, and are represented quite actively by what's going on now. And in fact, talk about with the Gulagichi, who are African Americans among the earliest who came to the continent, and the combination of the foods eaten by the Gulagichi and the other Lumbar tribes were what would become the Gulagichi food and later Southern cooking. And if you have red beans and rice or some other Southern dish, and you know what that is, remember where they came from. These were combinations of native dishes and African dishes fed to the plantation, use those people in bad ways. The tragedy of the Trail of Tears and the Cherokee people cannot be forgotten. They were forced to march for days at a time. If their children died, they carried their dead children's bodies for days, carried them by hand until they were allowed to stop and properly bury their children. That is part of our American legacy, and we cannot simply reject it. We can't say, well, we don't want to talk about that. We can't talk about not talking about it. We must remember it. And the tragedy of that goes on to this day. But going on further, besides that fight, another fight is taking place. And in that fight, Andrew Jackson is trying to get the congressman from Tennessee, Davy Crockett, to vote for his bill. And Davy Crockett not only won't stop fighting about it. Davy Crockett was an outdoorsman who became a congressman. He wasn't a slick lawyer He didn't understand politics the way we do, and it wasn't politics the way we understand it. Think of Abe Lincoln as a log splitter and as the postman. This is the time we're talking about. By the time Abe Lincoln is president, we're a much more sophisticated nation, especially in the northern states. But at this point, we're outdoorsmen and frontiersmen, where people like Jim Bridger and Kit Carson and Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone were our heroes and our leaders. And Andrew Jackson, with his belief in manifest destiny. And also our forefathers. So Andrew Jackson orders the Indian Removal Act. The Cherokees go to the Supreme Court and stand in opposition, along with Davy Crockett and many others who didn't believe in what they were doing. And Andrew Jackson said, I don't care what they say. We have the army. We're moving. Was that for safety? Was that to enhance the country? It was not. It was also not a moderate stance. It was a radical stance. And the people who led later became the radical Republicans, who took another attempt to take the politics away from the people and their elections and impose their will and what they wanted upon the Americans. Davy Crockett wouldn't stand for it. But he ran a very poor campaign. And the way that he talked as a frontiersman did not translate in the political fight in the same way. So Davy Crockett lost his congressional campaign. He was angry. Angry at what the voting was about, at the way he was treated, and at the way his friends were about to be treated, his allies, Cherokees, and other tribes. Davy Crockett gave a famous half-rambling speech that made almost no sense except to people who'd been following it closely. I don't know what that reminds me of, which politicians talk that way now, but I know there are some, because every so often I turn on news channels and I listen to them talk, and they frighten me. I'm not going to mention whose orange hair I'm speaking of, or Steve Bannon, or any of those people. I'm not going to mention them at all. But when they're talking, I know that there's something bad going on. Davy Crockett spoke that way, and he said, I'm leaving. That's it. It's not the country I grew up in anymore. I'm going to a different country. I'm going to Texas. And so he left Washington, D.C. He led his men to the Alamo, straight from Washington, D.C. Of course, Davy Crockett remains at the Alamo, and his legend remains in our hearts. But that's not what the story I'm telling today is about. It's kind of a little background to it. The story we're going to talk about today is the Supreme Court. Andrew Jackson frightened the Supreme Court by threatening to take away their power with the army. The Supreme Court allowed that threat to come to fruition. If the 7 justices think they can stop me, let them try, said the president. I have the army. I saw another president do that very recently. And he brought out Marines and National Guard, and the Supreme Court bent to his wishes. Bent to his wishes. Why would they do that? Bent to his wishes. So, at the time of the great General Grant's presidency, as the country was trying to put itself back together, and would later attempt to do this in 1876, they had 7 members of the court, which then went to 9, and then 8. And so they used manipulation to keep the number low, to keep the court on the side that they wanted it. This is not how our forefathers designed the unique judicial department and the Supreme Court. This was not the differences between powers and the separation of powers that our forefathers who talked about this discussion in the Federalist Papers, where people like John Jay and Hamilton and Adams communicated what they thought. This was the imposition of martial law. This was taking over an independent, free country with a leader that was not a democratic believer. You know, not everything about Donald Trump is bad, but the way that the Supreme Court found itself to Donald Trump and set up to make his events go the way he wanted is a shame. I will tell you that I am leading a movement of moderates, and the actions of the Supreme Court in support of Donald Trump are not the actions of moderates. They are the actions of extremists. These are the radical Republicans from the 1870s and 1860s, post-Civil War, that have come back to haunt us. These are leaders from places like Russia and Hungary and Turkey who do not lead with democracy and moderation in their heart. They lead with what they want in their heart. And this is my problem with Donald Trump. Davy Crockett still lives at the Alamo. But the spirit of Davy Crockett still lives in some of our hearts. And what the Supreme Court is doing is not what Davy Crockett would approve of. In 1869, attempting to manipulate the court so it stood with the way that certain politicians wanted to go, the number changed back and forth. But you know what? In those days, there wasn't the kind of billion-dollar corruption that there is today. It has been made obvious through reporting and through announcements that literally hundreds of millions, probably close to billions of dollars worth of graft has been provided to the judges who are on the Supreme Court, making people want the job. The job was a low-paying job for judges who cared more about law than they cared about money, because you could make way more money as a lawyer than as one of these judges. But that's not what we were given. Justices like Clarence Thomas, who have been taking million-dollar trips several times a year, being hobnobbed by the wealthy, and he never wrote any decisions until he was given the gift by lying, cheating, and a Republican Party who felt that this was acceptable. I have great respect for Mitch McConnell. But when Mitch McConnell did not allow Barack Obama his opportunity to get somebody from his side onto the Supreme Court, which would have allowed John Roberts to be a moderate and a voice between the forces, when he stopped that and waited until his Republicans would have a chance to vote on their man, he took away from American democracy. And every person who stood there and watched as things like United decision came down, saying that a corporation was as important as a person, and turned around the decision that saved the lives of people my age because of their only hope was to go to a non-surgical abortion, where they often got infection and died. According to the oral history of my high school, 3 students died in 1973. 3 students of the class of 1973 died from infections due to botched abortion. Those teenagers also live with the decisions of people who are taking away from democracy. The opportunity to make the court a democratic thing was there. And the Republican Party, for all the good things they did, took away our rights to have a free and independent judiciary on the claim that these people were forcing ideas. They didn't force ideas. They supported ideas. And very soon, that Supreme Court will not be there anymore. And what will happen is a whole new court will come up, because we cannot stand for the corruption. We cannot stand for the theft. We cannot stand for bringing people into office who are only doing it for the money. I am sorry. As much as I would like to say good things about Republicans and the Supreme Court, I just can't do it, because it's not happening that way. They are the radicals. They are forcing things down America's throats because they can get away with it. Because in the planning that we've talked about over the years, over the issues, because of the planning that the Republicans did, that we've talked about in previous episodes, that started with the loss of Barry Goldwater in 1964, they had the wherewithal to do it. Just because you can do it doesn't mean you should. And just because you want to do it, because you want your way, doesn't mean that that's what's best for America. So corruption and political expediency has become the earmark of the Supreme Court. What do we do about it? My opinion is that we're going to have to restructure the Supreme Court. The logical way to do it is to put in 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, 5 independents who are displaying acts as moderates, one of them being the Chief Justice, 4 of them being independents, which are now as numerous as are Democrats and Republicans. And those 4 groups, 3 actually with a leader who moderates that, will save this country. Not the politics that they're trying to impose on us. Imposing politics on people are not the solution. Claiming it's states' rights, that's the latest thing. No, the Supreme Court is only giving these rights back to the states. No, they're only taking these rights away from people and using that states' rights as an excuse. And if you think that that's an okay thing, then I refer back to the 1840s, 1850s, and 1860s when the South explained why they had the horror of slavery with the simple phrase, states' rights. A state has the right to decide what to do. No, it doesn't. A person has the right to decide how to live. The government has the right to issue protections for people, not crimes against them. Crimes against African Americans of slavery, crimes against Native Americans, of murder, of slaughter, and of poverty. To this day, the poorest county in the United States remains the Pine Ridge Reservation, where the last massacre, that of Wounded Knee, took place, where the water protectors live. Those are the remnants of the people from Little Bighorn. And those are people being punished with the economic crime of poverty and hunger. The poorest county in the nation is Pine Ridge Reservation. And that is the purest voice coming out of the Native people. They have fought for their lives, with their lives, and paid for it with their children's lives, and their grandchildren's, and their cultures, and everything else. We cannot speak about this without referring to places like Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and the Indian education system, which was done not to educate Native Americans, but to separate them from their culture. They cut their hair, they washed their mouth out with lye soap for speaking their native tongue. This was genocide, cultural genocide, with the intent of making them act like we wanted them to act. It's not how I want people to act, and it's not how I want them imposed. And when you see other groups being attacked by the Republicans today as part of their effort to use these separations between cultures for their political aims. When you see that, be ashamed. Be ashamed. Be ashamed. I want to say something I tell people. Since I wrote my dissertation, I said, we don't know the names of the people who built Washington, D.C. from scratch, brick by brick. But we know the names of their owners because they were slaves who were paid to their owners. We don't know their names. We don't know the names of the people who actually built it. We only know the people who enslaved these builders. That is not the legacy I want for America. That's not the legacy I want for Washington, D.C. It's not the legacy I want for the Pine Ridge Reservation or the Eastern Band of the Cherokees. The Cherokees have, within the last 10 years, relocated, through the use of their archaeologies and science, their original home of Katua, and have brought it back into the reservation lands in North Carolina. Few things have made me as proud of that. But I also want to talk about the mystery of Roanoke, the lost colony of Roanoke, who we found. And in this year and a half where we've been at the habitation level, and we really know what they wore and how they dressed and what they did, that it was the Native Americans who were the Croatans who rescued the lost colony of Roanoke and let them live out their lives while the Europeans left them to die. We now know this. And that story should bring us pride and shame, because these are the same Lumbar who, many of them, were also included in the Cherokees and other tribes' Trail of Tears. Trail of Tears is a legacy that lives with us today. Davy Crockett and the Alamo lives with us today. Andrew Jackson and his hatred and his belief in things that were not moral stays with us today. And we're not doing anything to change that. We're not making it happen. And some of it, I just don't know what to say. Many of you know I ran for office in 2006. One of the communities that I was running to represent in the District 100 that I was running was West Park, an African-American community that had been hobbled together when they were trying to get away from county-led rule into city-led rule. And they threatened the politicians of Westlake with, if they supported me, they would go after me because they knew that I was for reparations. My discussion of reparations, which was called educational reparations for slavery, was my dissertation for my master's degree from Nova Southeastern University. They said Barry Sacro runs with 40 issues on his card. 40 issues. You're going to blame this one on us? They said, yeah, because that way we get our way. Get our way. Well, that way is coming around. What we are doing to our country by allowing one side, and it doesn't matter which side, to get their way through the Supreme Court, through the laws, through the terrors that they put different communities through. What we are getting from that is bad things. Bad things for our children. Bad things for our neighbors. Bad things for the respect our country gets. Bad things for the business. So here's my answer. It's time to stop. Let's go back to being moderates. Let's go back to doing it the way that our forefathers, who put together a constitution that gave us this nation, told us to do it. I'm not giving up George Washington's dream of what the country would look like after the revolution, as he wrote to the Jewish community of Newport, Rhode Island. Every man his own fig tree, and the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness for everyone. This is the promise of America, and moderates, and acting in a moderate way can bring that back to us. If you believe as I do, I want you to take simple steps. Talk to people intelligently about politics. Don't just close them off. Don't say, oh, you're on the other side. Yes, I listen to this news or I watch that. Engage them. Have a longer conversation and share your thoughts. Because if you're listening to this kind of politics, politics of moderation, the politics of fairness, the politics of a great America, that is truly what's going to make America great. Not again, but still. America did not fall apart just because the Republicans weren't winning. America is falling apart because of that. And we're going to put it together as a group of moderates and as a group who need this politics to become the politics of our children. The politics of our children, the promise of our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren is a great country that will still be here. And we're going to do that by doing it the right way. And we're going to do it the right way for our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. We're going to do it the right way for our teachers and our nurses and our veterans. And we're going to protect it for the same reasons. When you see a police car coming up, do you pull over because you're afraid the policeman will give you a ticket? Or do you pull over out of respect for what a first responder does? I hope it's the latter. Because the first responders are part of what we're the promise of America. My baby boom generation, which last week we decided to blame for some of the ills of America, taught itself that the end wasn't how much money you make. It was how we make our money and how we treat other people. And people who don't care about that, businesses whose interest in the political process is more about accomplishing a goal and allowing their side to win, do so at their own peril. And if you don't believe me, go take a look at Michael's. Michael's and what is happening in Michael's stores, and go take a look at Hobby Lobby, who has used their will and their money to attack the politics of moderation by being anti-people. And what has come out of that is less people going to Hobby Lobby. I can tell you, I see a whole lot less Tesla trucks, or whatever you want to call that vehicle of Tesla, on the road since Doge and since plane crashes and ship accidents and diseases are getting through because people were put into a position to use counterintelligence to attack the organization. With all due respect to the smartest man of his generation, Robert Kennedy, his son is a nut. Okay? I'm sorry. I respect his opinion. I understand his opinion. He is a radical who wants to change some of how healthcare is done. I don't agree with him. I want you to warn me. I want you to tell me what you think. But I also don't want you to use that to make children's teeth fall out, like the attack on fluoride. By the way, that attack started under the John Birch Society in the 1950s. It was no less a lie then than it is now. No fluoride in the water is not going to prevent people from being homosexual. Okay? I can tell you that. Good marriages and good relationships, that's a good way to do that. We don't know what make people do what they do. And blaming people for that because you don't want them to turn out the way they turned out, well, that's a problem, isn't it? I think it's a problem. I'm pretty sure it's a problem. And if you ever wanted to turn out different and somebody else wanted you to turn out different, and they're still fighting to make you that, then you know what a problem that is. Yeah, I came from a pretty wild generation, and I don't know that I'm less wild for that. But I'm also a lot more attuned to what the actions of government can be and how that affects it. Class before me, the class of 1972, got draft numbers. And everybody wondered, were they running away from America or going to war when their number came up? By the time I went into the United States Coast Guard, the draft was over, and the war in Vietnam was winding down. That tragedy was winding down, as were people who would be coming home. Well, some of them would come home. Because as somebody of that age, I have people who will always be teenagers, who will always be lost to the generation. My wife's second husband died because of Agent Orange. He worked in the Air Force and loaded bombs, and he would come away literally drenched in Agent Orange, a carcinogen. It was 8 months after he died that the doctors contacted her and explained to her that the blood disease he had was terribly debilitating, incredibly painful, and specifically from Agent Orange and Paraquat. These decisions by our military did not change until a year and a half ago. Now the burn pits and other toxic exposures are being treated by the VA. But when my wife's second husband was there was no treatment until he was dying. And then they simply helped him die. It's a tragic story. No less tragic than any of 1,000 stories from Vietnam. No less tragic than 1,000 stories from the American urban and suburban landscapes. But it's a story we can fix and we can work on, which we are. And that's what I support. Moderates and acting as a moderate allows us to support that, allows us to truly support our veterans, not just in name, not just in thought, but in action and in deed. Let me tell you, I love the free lunch I get on Veterans Day and sometimes on Memorial Day, picnics and things like that. I really do. My dad and I go to them together. He was in the Army during Korea, combat medic, and I during Vietnam. And hopefully his great, great, great grandchildren won't be going to war because of the good decisions that we make. I want to leave this discussion with a prayer for our president. And it's a prayer that we're taught on what to think when war comes to Israel and what we are supposed to do. And the answer of what we are supposed to do is pray for the peace of Jerusalem. I pray for the peace of Jerusalem, for it is truly the peace of all of us. I pray for the peace of Washington, D.C., and I pray for the peace of neighborhoods in New York City. I pray for the peace that brings us. And I wish you a good day today. And I thank you for the time you've given me. And I remind you that moderation is not a single choice about a big step. It's a bunch of little choices. And we're going to be making those little choices together. I wish you a moderate day. Have a wonderful spiritual day. And pray for the peace of Jerusalem today. This is Barry Sacaro. We are Pivot Point Podcast, and we'll see you next week. Thanks.